Hey RV family, keep it tight. My name is Jay Morris, reviewing music for the love of music, and welcome back to the metal Tempest. And in this video I'm going to be covering the new Boris record entitled Heavy Rocks 2022, or 3. So this is a brand new record from the Japanese noise and experimental project Boris, but boiling them down to just that is completely impossible. They have released dozens of splits, of collaborations, of albums, of compilations that, keeping up with their discography, is insanely impressive if you're a diehard of them. And they have dabbled in pretty much every genre you can possibly imagine, from progressive to technical to experimental to extreme to everything in the book, usually put towards a noise or distorted sort of veneer. But this record is a little different, and anyone that's familiar with Boris will know that this is the third installment of an ongoing series that they do every 10 years, known as Heavy Rocks. It first debuted in 2002 with their fourth studio-length record, Heavy Rocks, and then returned in 2012 with Heavy Rocks 2012, or Heavy Rocks 2. And basically what these records have seek to do is not only re-envision their sound, but take more of a detour into their stoner, psychedelic, and classic rock roots. Most of the time these track listings aren't as noisy, aren't as abrasive, aren't as experimental and driven by feedback and heavy waves of experimentation, and is much more catchy, groovy, less technical, and more inclined to be in old school stoner rock, psychedelic rock, progressive rock, or just classic rock and roll music, obviously with the same level of absurdity that Boris usually entails. And I think that this record is a lot like those other two, and it certainly follows that formula to a T, but I think there are things to appreciate about this record that maybe weren't present on their others. Because at their core, remember, Boris is an experimental collective. At this point in time, it's pretty much encoded in their DNA. It runs through their blood to be experimental. And while it maybe didn't filter through as much on the other two installments of this series, I noticed that their experimental and noisy edge blurred through the lines more so across this record. In this record, while it is classic rock and roll, it has a very urgent, fast-paced, frantic, rushed, and just overall punkish tone, I would say, especially with the vocals. Though tracks like She Is Burning and Cramper remind me a lot of the Australian rock and experimental rock scenes nowadays. Just the fast-paced riffs and the high-voltage energy reminds me a lot of what you get from like King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, as well as Tropical Fuckstorm. It's still an exuberant, noisy sound, but in a slightly different way. It's more so noisy and coarse in the way they pace a track. It's a stern and overall no-frills type of record, and even though the band is performing rock and roll music, it's the way they execute it that I have to admire. Because with their noise, if you set that aside and just look solely at the rock and roll riffs and the rock and roll vocals, it's not just a wank fest of butt rock and dad rock riffs from the 70s being brought back in some sort of renaissance with weird production techniques and unnecessary progressions and weird solos that are unfitting. And I just want to talk about these two tracks I just mentioned, She's Burning and Cramper. These slight triumphant progressions that almost sound like a video game OST on She Is Burning, and can we just talk about how tasteful this solo is, or the tambourine hits on Cramper that sort of bring this track up to be more interesting than if it was just what it was on its own. And here's where I'll talk a little bit about why this track listing is different than their other two installments. Even though noise still blurred through the lines of the other two, they were much more psychedelic and stoner. But question one is when I started to really get the whiffs of noise rockian influences. And this track listing, more so than rock and roll, feels a lot more inclined like noise rock to me. While it is a capstone to a decade's work and also a venture into distant lands of experimentation with rock and roll music, just plain rock and roll music, there still is a rough, heavy, noisy, abrasive, off-putting edge to it that makes these tracks more intriguing to listen to, that makes these tracks more engaging to listen to. But it is conducted in a different way for people that might not like Boris typically for being as noisy as they are, but still, the feedback, the distortion, the oddity of the vocals at certain points, the progressions in the guitar riffs, the frazzled out guitar solos, even if it's rock and roll at its core, it has the Boris hallmark, the stamp of approval, if you will. And back to question 1, it's pretty diametrically opposed to a lot of the other tracks here. It's longer, it's more technically dense, it's more progressively apt, going from a noise rock inspired almost Daughters-esque introduction, expansive instrumental psychedelics, and then catapulting you into very harsh metallic absurdity. It's layered, it's heavy, it is loud, these vocals are blown out, and the rock and roll is just ascending and descending in not only a really catchy way, but also just an unsettling way. The darkness of this instrumental reminds me and could be reminiscent of a band like Blue Oyster Cult. Desert-like, alien-like, foreboding, but catchy as hell. These riffs on this record pop. Nosferatou is another example of that. Old school riffs, but with enough distortion, feedback, roided up vocals, and an overall electrifying production to bring it all together to keep you on the edge of your seat. And a healthy amount of tactics to sort of stretch out these riffs in a very unwelcoming way to acclimate you with what Boris is doing across this album. I will say though, at its core, this record is a Boris album. I think this is a damn good rock and roll record. Definitely one of the better ones I've heard this year, and I don't really have that many complaints of it, despite the fact that it is sometimes odd to decipher. It is a very catchy record, and I think it's just unbridled fun. But even though it does have that sort of unbridled funness of classic rock and roll music, Boris still puts in enough of their own experimental edge to make this a noisy outing for people that have enjoyed bands like Boris, like Merzbow, like Sun, like The Body. And I am excited with their sound. Sometimes it can become a little chaotic for my liking, and not necessarily in the experimentally pleasant way, more so they take a track in 50 different directions at one time that make it a little difficult to decipher, but most of this record tends to be cohesive, tends to be tangible. I don't think they went overboard on effects, especially on the vocals, and judging this record as a Boris record can prove to be difficult because you want to base it on, their sound prior and what you expect from them, but considering that this is not only a very specific series in their discography, but also astronomically different than many other tracks and records that they have made in recent memory, it becomes difficult to really weigh it. But overall, just judging it standalone as an experimental rock and a noise rock record, it is one of the best standouts of the year, and I don't really have that many complaints other than just it is a Boris record at its core and a little predictable at times. Even though they are going in a lot of different directions, you can kind of start to get a feel for the pattern that they are working with, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing when they sound this good. But yeah, overall, I'm going to be giving this album an 8 out of 10. And that is a wrap. Have you heard this new Boris record, Heavy Rocks 2022 or 3? If you have, let me know in the comment section below what you thought about it. I would love to discuss this record with you. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.